In the theater, there is a tradition known as the ghost light. It is a single bulb, left burning on a stand in the center of the stage when the theater is empty, when the actors have gone, and the audience has returned to their lives. Its purpose is practical, to keep people from falling into the orchestra pit in the dark, but its meaning is spiritual. It is there to appease the ghosts. It is a promise that the show will return. 1962 was the year Hollywood's ghost light began to flicker. The old gods were dying. The studio system, that monolithic factory of dreams that had ground up boys from Ohio and girls from foster homes and spit them out as gods, was crumbling under its own weight. Television was the new barbarian at the gate. The world was speeding up, jets, rockets, nuclear missiles, rock and roll. The slow, golden syrup of the 1950s was curdling. And at the center of this collapsing empire, on the scorched asphalt of the 20th Century Fox lot, a tragedy was being filmed in Technicolor. The movie was titled Something's Got to Give. A comedy. A farce. A lie. It would become the most expensive home movie ever made, a testament to the destruction of the most famous woman in history, and the quiet, unwavering honor of the man who stood beside her until the very end. Stage 14. If you closed your eyes, you could smell the desperation. It smelled like stale coffee, burning tungsten, and expensive cologne masking the scent of fear. 20th Century Fox was not just a studio, it was a sinking ship. In Rome, the production of Cleopatra was hemorrhaging money at a rate that defied mathematics. Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton were spending millions on a love affair that was scandalizing the Vatican, while the studio executives back in Los Angeles were watching the stock price plummet. They needed a hit. They didn't just want one, they required one to keep the lights on. Enter the sacrificial lambs. Dean Martin and Marilyn Monroe. It was the perfect equation on paper. Dean, the king of cool, the man who had conquered music, movies, and nightclubs with a drink in his hand and a shrug on his shoulders. And Marilyn, the golden girl, the phosphorescent creature who commanded the gaze of the entire planet. Put them together, add a screwball script about a wife returning from the dead, and listen to the cash registers ring. But stage 14 was not a place of laughter. It was a waiting room. Dean Martin sat in his canvas chair, legs crossed, reading a racing form. He looked immaculate. The sharkskin suit was tailored to within a millimeter of perfection. His hair was a sculpted wave of dark silk. He looked like a man without a care in the world. He joked with the grip, he flirted harmlessly with the script girl, he hummed Italian arias under his breath. But Dean was a watcher. His relaxed posture was a camouflage. Behind the heavy-lidded eyes, he was scanning the room, reading the temperature. He saw the director, George Cukor, pacing like a nervous cat, chewing on the end of his glasses. He saw the executives in their gray suits, hovering in the shadows like vultures waiting for a carcass. And he saw the empty chair. It sat next to his, a canvas director's chair with Marilyn stenciled in black letters on the back. For days, it had been empty. The silence emanating from that chair was louder than the construction noise outside. Every hour she was late cost the studio thousands. Every day she didn't show up fueled the whispers. She's crazy, they hissed. She's on pills. She's drunk. She's finished. Dean heard them. He said nothing. He knew something the executives didn't. He knew that Marilyn Monroe was a costume, a heavy, suffocating suit of armor that Norma Jean Baker had to strap on every morning. And he knew that the armor was getting too heavy to carry. He didn't see a diva disrespecting his time. He saw a terrified little girl hiding in her house in Brentwood, paralyzed by the fear that the world was finally going to realize she was just human. So he waited. He practiced his golf swing with a prop cane. He drank his apple juice. He held the line. When she finally appeared, it was usually in the afternoon. The soundstage door would open, and the air pressure in the room would drop. She didn't walk in, she drifted. Flanked by her acting coach, Paula Strasberg, a dark, brooding figure dressed entirely in black who hovered over Marilyn like a grim reaper. Marilyn looked fragile enough to break if you touched her. Her skin was translucent, glowing with that strange, unearthly light that only true movie stars possess. It wasn't makeup, it was biology. But her eyes were darting, frightened, red-rimmed. She would whisper apologies to Cukor, to the crew. She was terrified of the camera. The machine that had loved her for a decade had turned into a weapon. The dynamic between Dean and Marilyn was a study in contrasts. Dean was from the school of, show up, know your lines, hit your mark, go home. He didn't believe in deep psychological excavation. For Dean, acting was a job, like laying bricks or dealing cards. You do it well, you get paid, you buy a sandwich. Marilyn was the opposite. She was a disciple of the method. She needed to feel the pain, the motivation, the sense memory. She needed to bleed internally to say, hello, convincingly. Paula Strasberg would whisper in her ear for 20 minutes before a take, digging up old traumas to get the right expression. The crew expected friction. They expected Dean, the consummate professional, to explode at this inefficiency. They expected him to mock the method nonsense. But he didn't. Dean watched Marilyn with a profound, gentle patience. When Cukor would scream, cut, because Marilyn flubbed a line for the 10th time, Dean wouldn't roll his eyes. He would reach out, squeeze her hand, and make a joke. Don't worry, honey, he'd say. I was thinking about a ham sandwich anyway. Let's do it again. He became her shield. He understood, perhaps instinctively, that they were both frauds. He was the drunk who was sober, she was the sex bomb who was a frightened intellectual. They were both playing characters to survive. And in that shared deception, there was a bond. He treated her not like a co-star, but like a little sister who had wandered into a dangerous neighborhood. May turned to June. The heat rose. The tension on set was becoming unsustainable. The executives were demanding footage. They needed something to show the shareholders. They needed a headline that wasn't, Marilyn is late again. The script called for a swimming pool scene. Marilyn's character was supposed to be skinny dipping, enticing Dean's character from the water. In 1962, this was handled with camera angles and flesh-colored body stockings. The censorship board, the Hays Code, was still a dragon watching over the gates of morality. The day of the shoot, the set was closed. Only essential crew. The water in the pool was heated, lit from below with blue gels that made it look like a sapphire. Marilyn emerged from her dressing room in a robe. She looked tired. The weight of the delays, the anger of the studio, the constant presence of the doctors and the pills, it was etching lines of sorrow onto her soul. She walked to the edge of the pool. Dean was there, fully dressed in his suit, waiting. He smiled at her. A real smile. Water's fine, he said. Marilyn dropped the robe. She was wearing the body stocking. She slid into the water. They did a few takes. It wasn't working. It felt stiff. Fake. And Marilyn Monroe, at the end of her rope, decided she was done with fake. She swam to the edge. She peeled off the body stocking. She threw it onto the deck. A gasp went through the crew. The cameraman almost forgot to focus. Marilyn Monroe was naked. But it wasn't sexual. That's the tragedy of the photos that would later circulate. The world saw sex. Dean, standing feet away, saw freedom. For the first time in weeks, Marilyn was laughing. She splashed in the water, kicking her legs, throwing her head back. She wasn't the studio's property in that moment, she was a mermaid, slippery and unreachable. She was taunting the system that tried to own her. Dean played the scene perfectly. He sat by the edge, shielding her with his body from the more prying eyes of the grips up in the rafters. He laughed with her. The photos show them, Dean looking down with a bemused, affectionate grin, Marilyn looking up, wet, radiant, alive. It was the eye of the storm. For an hour, the shark circled but couldn't bite. It was the last time she would ever feel that light. While the studio was counting pennies on stage 14, a request came from the White House. President John F. Kennedy's birthday gala. Madison Square Garden. May 19. Marilyn wanted to go. She needed to go. It was validation. It was proof that she wasn't just an actress, she was an American icon. The studio said no. They told her that if she was too sick to work on the movie, she was too sick to fly to New York. She went anyway. Dean watched it on television like the rest of America. He saw her walk out onto that stage, wrapped in white ermine. He saw her take off the fur to reveal that dress, a web of rhinestones that looked like she was wearing nothing but starlight. He heard the gasp of 15,000 people. And he heard her sing, "Happy Birthday, Mr. President." It was breathless. It was seductive. It was tragic. Dean, watching with a glass of scotch in his hand, a real one this time, felt a knot in his stomach. He knew the cost of that performance. He knew the executives at Fox were watching too, and they weren't applauding. They were sharpening their knives. By defying them, by looking so healthy and vibrant on a stage in New York after claiming illness in Los Angeles, she had handed them the weapon they needed to kill her. She flew back to LA the next day, high on the adrenaline of the gala. But the locks on the studio gates were already changing. The hammer fell on a Friday. In Hollywood, they call it Trash Day, the day you fire people so the news gets buried in the Saturday papers. But you couldn't bury this. 20th Century Fox didn't just fire Marilyn Monroe. They declared war on her. They issued a press release that was savage in its cruelty. They sued her for $750,000, a fortune in 1962. They leaked stories to the gossip columnists, Hedda Hopper, Luella Parsons, painting her as a mentally unstable, drug-addicted wreck. They said she was unemployable. They effectively ended her career with a typewritten memo. Marilyn collapsed. She retreated into her hacienda-style home in Brentwood. The curtains were drawn against the sun. She lay in bed, surrounded by bottles of Nembutal and script pages that no longer mattered. She called people, Frank Sinatra, Joe DiMaggio, Peter Lawford. Her voice was slurred, panicked. "They're killing me," she said. "They're erasing me." The studio wasted no time. They had a schedule to keep. They announced that the role of Ellen Arden would be recast immediately. They hired Lee Remick. Lee Remick was everything Marilyn was not. She was professional. She was punctual. She was sane. She was a fantastic actress. The studio executives breathed a sigh of relief. They had cut out the cancer. Now, they just needed to get the machine running again. They had the sets. They had the script. They had the new leading lady. And they had Dean Martin under a binding contract. They assumed Dean would be relieved. They assumed he would be happy to trade the chaos of Marilyn for the stability of Lee Remick. They assumed he was just like them, a businessman who cared about the bottom line. It was the biggest miscalculation in the history of Hollywood. Dean Martin received the summons to the executive offices. He drove his dual Ghia to the lot, parking in his reserved spot. He wore a dark suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie. He walked through the corridors of power, nodding to secretaries, looking for all the world like a man coming to sign a receipt. The conference room was cold. The air conditioning was set to Arctic. The men at the table, Spiro Skouras and the other Fox overlords, were smiling. They offered him a cigar. They offered him a drink. "We've got good news, Dino," one of them said, sliding a contract across the mahogany table. "We've got Lee Remick." "Great girl." Talented. We start shooting Monday. No more delays. We're going to finish this picture in 6 weeks. Dean didn't sit down. He stood at the end of the table, his hands resting on the back of a chair. He looked at the contract. He looked at the men. Lee Remick is a wonderful actress, Dean said. His voice was level, conversational. She's a doll. I did a movie with her before. I like her. The executive smiled. Exactly. It's going to be great. Dean reached into his pocket, pulled out his gold lighter, and clicked it. The flame danced in the cold air. But I have a contract, Dean continued. And my contract gives me approval of the leading lady. The smiles faltered. Yes, well, technically. And I signed on to do a movie with Marilyn Monroe. Dean snapped the lighter shut. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. I have the greatest respect for Miss Remick, Dean repeated. But you hired me to play opposite Marilyn. You fired Marilyn. So. He leaned forward, placing both hands on the table, leaning into their space. No Marilyn. No picture. Pandemonium. The executives jumped up. They shouted. They threatened. You can't do this. We'll sue you for breach of contract. We'll sue you for $5 million. You'll never work in this town again, Martin. Dean stood there, letting the waves of anger crash over him. He didn't blink. He was back in the gambling dens of Steubenville, holding a royal flush while the other guys held garbage. He knew they were bluffing. He knew Cleopatra was bankrupting them. They couldn't afford to lose him. They couldn't afford to scrap the movie. Sue me, Dean said softly. He turned his back on the most powerful men in Hollywood. I'm going to play golf. Call me when she's back. He walked out of the room, past the stunned secretaries, out into the blinding California sun. He got into his car and drove away. It was an act of samurai loyalty in a town of mercenaries. Dean Martin had just put his entire career on the line for a woman who had, by all accounts, made his life miserable for 2 months. Why? Because Dean knew the game. He knew that if they could do this to Marilyn Monroe, if they could discard her like trash, they could do it to anyone. He was drawing a line in the sand. He was saying, you don't get to kill the queen while the king is watching. The silence that followed Dean Martin's ultimatum was deafening. He went back to his home in Bel Air, poured a drink, and waited. He played golf. He watched television. He acted as if he hadn't just held a gun to the head of a major corporation. The press went wild. Martin quits. Says no to Fox. The headlines screamed rebellion. For the first time, the narrative shifted. It wasn't just, crazy Marilyn, anymore, it was, loyal Dean. By standing with her, he lent her his credibility. If the coolest, most professional man in Hollywood thought she was worth waiting for, maybe she was. Back at the studio, panic set in. Cleopatra was now costing so much money that 20th Century Fox was literally selling off its backlit real estate to pay the electric bills. They couldn't afford a lawsuit with Dean Martin. They couldn't afford to scrap Something's Got to Give. They were trapped. 4 days later, the phone rang in Dean's study. It was the studio. They had caved. We're bringing her back, Dino, the executive said, his voice tight with humiliation. We're ripping up the lawsuit. We're giving her a new contract. We're even replacing the director. Just, please come back. Dean didn't gloat. He didn't say, I told you so. He just took a sip of his drink and said, let me know when the cameras are ready. When Marilyn heard the news, she wept. She called Dean. Her voice, usually breathless with performance, was raw with gratitude. You saved me, she whispered. Nobody has ever done that for me. Nobody. Dean deflected the praise, as he always did. "It was selfish, honey," he lied. "I just didn't want to learn new lines with a new girl. I'm lazy, remember?" But it wasn't laziness. It was the code of Steubenville. You dance with the one who brought you. They set a date for filming to resume, October 1962. It felt like a fresh start. The summer stretched out before them, a time for healing, for rest. Marilyn did photo shoots for Vogue, looking more beautiful and ethereal than ever. She seemed to be rising from the ashes, buoyed by the knowledge that she wasn't alone. But Hollywood tragedies rarely happen in a straight line. They spiral. While Dean went back to the sands to perform with the Rat Pack, Marilyn drifted into the orbit of Frank Sinatra and the darker side of the family. Late July. The Calneva Lodge, on the border of California and Nevada. A place owned by Sinatra, frequented by mob boss Sam Giancana, and monitored by the FBI. Marilyn went there for a weekend. What happened behind those closed doors remains one of the great mysteries of the 20th century. Rumors of overdoses, sexual coercion, political threats, and photos that could topple a presidency swirling like smoke. Dean wasn't there. He stayed away from the Calneva. He knew the temperature of that place. He knew that Frank played a dangerous game, mixing show business with organized crime and politics. Dean's detachment, the very thing that frustrated Frank, was what kept him safe. But Marilyn? Marilyn was a moth drawn to the blue flame. She returned from that weekend broken. The light that had returned to her eyes after Dean's intervention was extinguished. She was erratic, terrified, making phone calls to the White House that were never returned. She felt the walls closing in again. The victory Dean had bought her was slipping through her fingers like sand. She was realizing that the studio was just one head of the Hydra, the other heads were far more dangerous. Saturday, August 4, 1962. A hot, suffocating day in Los Angeles. The Santa Ana winds were blowing, kicking up dust, making the palm trees rattle like dry bones. Dean was at home. He had played a round of golf, had a quiet dinner. He was preparing for the resumption of filming in a few weeks. He had his script on the nightstand, with notes in the margins about how to make Marilyn laugh in the upcoming scenes. In Brentwood, at 12305 Fifth Helena Drive, Marilyn Monroe was alone. Her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, was there, but Marilyn was alone in the way that matters, trapped inside her own mind. She spoke to Peter Lawford on the phone around 7 p.m. Her speech was slurred. "Say goodbye to Pat," she said. "Say goodbye to the president. And say goodbye to yourself, because you're a nice guy." Then, silence. The phone rang in Dean Martin's house in the early hours of Sunday morning. It was the call every actor dreads. The call that marks the end of an era. "Dean, she's gone." Dean sat on the edge of his bed in the dark. He didn't ask for details. He didn't ask if it was suicide, or an accident, or something else. He knew the machine. He knew it ground people down until there was nothing left but powder. "How?" he asked, finally. "Pills. Nembutal." They found her in bed. Dean hung up. He didn't cry. He didn't throw the phone. He walked to his window and looked out at the city lights of Los Angeles. Millions of lights, each one representing a dream, and the brightest one had just burned out. He poured a glass of scotch. He didn't drink it. He just held it, watching the ice melt, feeling the cold glass against his palm. He thought about the pool. He thought about her laugh. He thought about the empty chair. "Sweet kid," he whispered to the empty room. Just a sweet kid. The aftermath was a circus. The press descended on Brentwood like locusts. Theories multiplied. The Kennedys did it. The mob did it. The studio did it. Dean stayed silent. He refused interviews. He refused to turn his grief into a soundbite. Then came the final blow. Joe DiMaggio, Marilyn's ex-husband and the only man who truly loved Norma Jean, not Marilyn, took charge of the funeral. Joe hated Hollywood. He hated the Rat Pack. He blamed them, Frank specifically, but the whole group by association, for dragging Marilyn back into the darkness. Joe made a list for the funeral. It was short. No producers. No directors. No studio heads. And no Rat Pack. Frank Sinatra was banned. Sammy Davis Jr. was banned. And Dean Martin, the man who had risked his career to save her, was banned. It hurt. Friends said it was one of the few times they saw Dean genuinely wounded. He had stood by her when everyone else ran. He had been her champion. But he understood Joe's anger. To Joe, Dean was just another tuxedo in the crowd that had suffocated her. So, on the day of the funeral, while Joe DiMaggio leaned over the casket and whispered, "I love you, I love you, I love you," Dean Martin sat in his home, miles away. He sent flowers, red roses, but he didn't try to crash the gate. He respected the silence. He mourned her in his own way, watching an old western, letting the gunfire on the screen drown out the noise of the world. Something's Got to Give was scrapped. The studio wrote it off as a tax loss. They took the footage, about 37 minutes of film, packed it into canisters, and buried it in the Fox vaults. It was considered cursed. For decades, it sat there. Darkness. Dust. The image of a laughing Marilyn and a smiling Dean, frozen in time, waiting for a projector that would never run. In the 1980s, archivists finally opened the canisters. They expected the film to be degraded, ruined. But when they ran it, the colors were shockingly vibrant. And there was the proof. The footage vindicated Marilyn. She wasn't the stumbling wreck the studio claimed. She was luminous. Her timing was sharp. And her chemistry with Dean was electric. But what strikes you most when you watch it today is Dean. You see it in his eyes. He isn't looking at her like a co-star. He is looking at her with a protective, gentle amusement. In the scenes where she is acting flustered, Dean is there, grounding her, holding the space so she can fly. You can see the bond. You can see why she called him her savior. When the footage was finally released in a documentary, Dean was already an old man, fading into his own silence after the death of his son. He reportedly watched it once. He watched the pool scene. He watched the woman he tried to save splash in the blue water. He turned off the TV and never spoke of it again. Dean Martin lived for another 33 years after Marilyn Monroe died. He became the highest-paid entertainer in the world. He had the TV show, the records, the acclaim. But those who looked closely saw that the walls around him grew higher after 1962. He had seen the face of the beast. He had seen how quickly the industry could devour its own children. He realized that cool was the only defense. If you don't care, they can't hurt you. If you don't let them in, they can't kick you out. Marilyn Monroe died trying to be loved by everyone. Dean Martin survived by needing love from no one. But sometimes, on quiet nights at the Sands, when the show was over and the band was packing up, Dean would sit at the bar with a drink. And if you caught him at the right moment, you might see him looking at an empty stool next to him. Not with sadness, but with a nod of recognition. He was the last gentleman of a brutal era. The man who said no to the machine. The next time you see that famous photo of Marilyn in the pool, laughing over her shoulder, look at the man in the suit standing on the deck. Look at his hands. He isn't reaching out to grab her. He isn't reaching out to take. He is standing guard. And in A City of Thieves, that was the only true act of love.